Just a quick note to say that this episode of Magic Like This does have a few trigger warnings in it. There is mention of mental health struggles, suicidal thoughts, family bereavement, trauma, miscarriage, and generally a sense of engaging with this idea of suffering in profound and personal ways. Because in this episode, I'll be sharing my testimony with you. So if that's something that is going to be really difficult for you, dear listener, please feel free to not listen to this episode or to skip ahead during the sections where I mention these things. It is woven throughout the episode, so I don't have specific timestamps for you, but you can skip ahead, usually 10 to 15 seconds, and I move on from that topic that I'm mentioning. So be blessed, friends. Take care of yourself. Hello, lovely listeners. You're listening to Magic Like This, a C.S. Lewis book club podcast, and it is Easter Monday. This is your Easter Monday special with your host, Christina Wallace. That's me. And if you've been around for a while, you'll know that we have been going through the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. We've been doing it letter by letter, going nice and slow. But for Easter Monday, for the Easter special that I am releasing for you guys, I wanted to do something a little bit different. And I deliberated over this for longer than I'd care to admit, but I sort of verbally processed it with my dear friend Dusty, who you will have heard if you've been listening to the podcast. She was on the Christmas special, and she's also on one of the exclusive episodes that is only available on Substack for paid book club members. That's over at magiclikethis.substack.com in case you're interested. But you'll know Dusty's name, you'll know Dusty's voice, and I was kind of processing with her about this idea that I had for an Easter special. So if you've been here for a while, you'll probably appreciate what this episode's going to be about. If you're brand new here, you're going to be terribly disappointed, and I would really advise that you go back and listen to previous episodes, because the reason I deliberated over this for so long is because I'm not going to be focusing exclusively on C.S. Lewis today, which feels a bit counterintuitive. This is a C.S. Lewis podcast. But the reason that I'm not focusing on Lewis today is that it felt like a good time to just give you guys a little bit more insight into who I am. I know from personal experience that I really appreciate learning a little bit more about the hosts of the podcast that I listen to. And it just felt like the right time to do that. So in this episode, and for Easter, which is my favorite holiday of the year, where we celebrate the joyful, victorious resurrection of Jesus Christ, I just thought I would share a little bit of my testimony with you. And if that's not something that interests you, I'm really sorry. I wish you a happy Easter. I pray that your celebrations have been restful and beautiful, and you can just check back in with me for the next episode when we get back to the Screwtape Letters. If, however, you are a little bit interested in learning more about the person whose voice you listen to, then stay tuned, because I'm just going to share a little bit with you about how I sort of started this podcast and why, and my general testimony and story leading up to this point. So this isn't going to be a particularly long episode. I know the Christmas special was split into 2 parts because it was so long, and this is going to be an Easter egg size episode. But I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. I remember the first time that I shared my testimony in a public setting, and it was at summer camp in 2011. I had just graduated from high school, and I went to my first and only Christian summer camp in central California up in the mountains. And it was a small group of people. There was 2 sites in this kind of campus of Christian camp within the mountains of a place called Hume Lake. And there was the massive camp where there was about 1,000 kids, and then there was a smaller camp called Wildwood, and that was for sort of older, sort of junior and seniors in high school, and it was a bit more focused on intense discipleship. And we were given an opportunity to share our testimony, and I had never done that before. I didn't really think that my testimony was anything important to share. I didn't really understand how it might inspire anybody or what it might mean. I don't know. It was just one of those things where I felt like God was calling me to do it. I couldn't really understand why. I didn't really feel like I had anything important to share. But I went to one of the camp counselors and I said, hey, here's my story. If you think it would be helpful, I'll share on one of the nights, because there were different people sharing their testimony each night of the week that we were there. And so I'm going to start there. And obviously I was 18 years old at the time, so I'm going to share a little bit of what I shared when I was 18. And then I'm going to share a little bit of how my story has continued to unfold from that point when I stood up on a little log pedestal and looked out to some of my closest friends in the middle of the woods and told them my story. So I was raised in a Christian home, which is a very sort of typical way of starting out your testimony when you were brought up in the US, and particularly where I was brought up in Southern California. In case you didn't recognize my accent, I am American by birth, but I've lived in the UK for almost half my life now. But I was raised in a Christian home. I was raised in a very typical evangelical home. My mum took me to church every Sunday. I grew up in a Calvary Chapel church until I was about, I want to say 9. And then we withdrew from church for a really long time because there was some abusive social structures that caused my mum to want to withdraw. And by virtue of that, I sort of withdrew as well. And as all of that kind of in and out of church was going on, I had been battling since I had been maybe 4 or 5. I'd been diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, which you'll hear the term OCD thrown around a lot very flippantly as if it were just describing someone who likes things to be clean. But it is actually a quite severe mental health disorder that I'd been diagnosed with at a really young age, which is quite unusual for someone of sort of 4 or 5 years old to be diagnosed with OCD. And I was dealing with OCD sort of on and off throughout my childhood, and it was really debilitating and really absorbed a huge element of my mental energy. It shaped my childhood in some really fundamental ways, but it kind of went dormant around the age of 6 or 7. And then when I was about 11, it creeped back up again out of nowhere. And the thing is that because I had been diagnosed when I was 5, I sort of forgot about the diagnosis. I sort of forgot about the way that things had impacted me when I was little as it came back up again in my preteens. Because when it came back up again in my preteens, I was experiencing it in a very different format. So when I was a child, it was a lot of hand washing, a lot of repetitive words. I would repeat words and repeat particular syllables in this weird kind of obsessive way. But as I hit my preteens and the OCD kind of came back up again, it was manifesting itself very differently in the form of intrusive thoughts. And when I say intrusive thoughts, I mean really, really violent thoughts, really, really sexual thoughts, just ugly imagery that would play in my mind and stick in my mind as if it were a broken record. And I didn't understand what was going on. And I didn't make the connection that it was OCD because I'd sort of forgotten the diagnosis when I was little. And I also didn't realize that this was another version of OCD. So all of this is kind of going on throughout my childhood, in and out of my life, and sort of shaping the way that I see the world as we are sort of in and out of church. And I really had a crisis of faith around the age of sort of 12, because these intrusive thoughts, this form of OCD, it didn't, how do I put this? I was so terrified of my own brain and the thoughts that I was having that I was scared to tell anybody. So I kind of suffered in silence with these thoughts for a few years. So if they cropped back up when I was 11, I was around 14 before I told my mom what was going on. And those few years where I was silent and I wasn't in church because we'd kind of withdrawn from church was really difficult. Now, my mum never walked away from her faith, even though we sort of withdrew from church. She was still actively practicing her faith and sharing that with us. She also gave us a lot of freedom to decide what we believed. She didn't impose her beliefs on us. She just taught us what she believed and let us make our own decisions. And so I was in this state of not really being in a traditional church environment, having the freedom to choose what I believe, which I was incredibly grateful for, and suffering in silence with this mental health condition that literally made me think that I was demon possessed because of the ugliness of the thoughts that would play in my brain on repeat every second of every day for 3 years. And I remember I used to come home from school and I would try to force myself to go to sleep at 4 p.m. just so I could shut my brain off. It was agonizing. And I eventually reached a point around 14 years old where I couldn't cope anymore. And I told my mom what was going on. And by saying I couldn't cope, basically what I mean is I'd reached a point where I'd stopped believing in God entirely. And I'd also started to deal with suicidal thoughts. And I didn't have any sorts of ideation, but I definitely had this mindset of like, if this is what the next 70, 80 years of my life are going to be, I don't really see the point in living because this is agony. And so I was really struggling with that, and I had cried out to God again and again, please take this away from me. Please take these thoughts away, God. What have I done to deserve being plagued with this agony in my mind? I can't even function. I can't, play with my brother or go and see friends because I'm so afraid of like me hurting them or something. Like there was just so many thoughts in my head that were so graphic and terrifying. And so by the time I finally reached out to my mom, I had decided that either God didn't exist, or if he did exist, he didn't love me because he was just allowing me to suffer. And I was really unmotivated to fight for my life. And I wouldn't say I was suicidal by any stretch of the imagination, but I was a level of hopeless that I just didn't care whether I lived or died. I had no intention of hurting myself because I knew that would hurt the people around me who I loved, but I also had no motivation to fight for my life. And I felt even more hopeless for the fact that my view of God was very much either he's not real or he's real, but he's not good. And I came to my mum with that sort of level of darkness around me and inside of me. And obviously my mum's heart broke, and she immediately looked into getting me some help. And I ended up having the blessed and privileged opportunity of receiving private therapy from the only OCD clinic in Southern California that specialized in OCD for youth. And I shared all this part of my testimony while I was at Wildwood. And the moral of the story up to that point in my life was effectively that eventually I found my way back to God. And once I did, I looked back at that season of my life where I was battling mental health. And I realized that when I was crying out to God and asking him to take the pain away, to take these thoughts away, to heal me, I was waiting for a miracle. right? I was waiting for a supernatural miracle for me to just wake up one day and for those thoughts to just go away. And actually, God had already provided me with everything I needed to heal. He provided me with a mom who loved me enough to immediately and proactively find me some help, and a dad who loved me and earned enough money to afford the help that my mom found for me. So I was provided with the resources, effectively, of loving parents, of a mom who was proactive, and a dad who was willing to pay the very top dollar price of getting me very bespoke therapy. And after 6 months of being in therapy, I would more or less say that I was healed of OCD. And I still deal with it to a certain degree. In certain settings and occasions, it'll crop up. Every few years, something will happen and I will have a bit of an OCD episode. But I'm so well equipped to deal with it. And I was given some very thorough and detailed and prescriptive exercises that could help me rewire my neural pathways effectively to cope with these thoughts and eventually to phase these thought patterns out of my normal day-to-day. It was an immense blessing, and I do believe that it was God healing me through a very practical toolbox of resources, through good parents who loved me and could afford the help that I needed, through the proximity to an OCD clinic that we could get to. We would drive 2 hours to Los Angeles every Saturday for months, but it was doable. And with a really good therapist who helped me and who gave me the insight that I needed into the condition that I had and the resources that I needed to retrain my brain and to heal. And I came out the other side, sort of 15, 16 years old. At that point, I still didn't really feel very close to God, but my world had opened up again. I felt like I could function. I could see the world through a new lens. I didn't see the world through the lens of my own depravity, of my own just like utter evil, because that's how I felt with the OCD. I felt evil. And if you had the kind of graphic images that are worthy of a horror movie just waltzing around your brain all the time, you would see the world through the lens of your own depravity. You would be terrified of yourself and terrified of interacting with the world around you. You would stop seeing beauty in anything. You would stop believing that God is good. But after therapy, I started to heal, and I started to see that the world might be beautiful again, and that I had a place within it, and that I wasn't sheer evil and depraved, but I also had a capacity for love and beauty and goodness and compassion inside of me, and I was ready to engage with my life again. And then over time, I started to get curious about God again. I spent some time just sort of researching and learning about lots of different faith systems. I intensely studied Islam and Buddhism and Judaism. I was very fascinated. I threw myself into my religious studies courses in high school, and I even took more religious studies courses in community college. And I just knew, something in my spirit knew that there was still something out there, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. And eventually I found myself back in church. This is by no surprise, but because I started dating a boy. And I fell in love with this boy, and this boy was a bass player at a worship team in a church that was quite prominent in my area. And he invited me to come back to church. And when I came back to church, I met Jesus again. There's not a specific moment that I can remember where it just all clicked for me. It was just like I realized, I don't know, it was a very prodigal son type of thing where I just felt like I'd come home, and there wasn't a distinct moment where I knocked on the door and the door opened and I walked over the threshold and came home. It was like I'd sleepwalked back into my home, and I woke up and I just realized I was suddenly there, and that feeling of comfort and safety and familiarity and belonging, and just knowing this is exactly where I was always from and always meant to be. This is where I dwell in safety and life and goodness and holiness and all of those things. It just happened. And there I was, worshiping God in church, desperate to go every Sunday, whether my boyfriend was there or not, and eating up every teaching, drinking in the scripture, so interested and fascinated by how someone could break down the scriptures and help me apply them to my own life. And so I got to my senior year, and this church that I had started attending for about 2 years offered an apologetics course for seniors who were about to graduate high school and go into university. And let me tell you something. If you've been listening to Magic Like This for a while, you'll probably have picked up on the fact that I have a few bones to pick with certain elements of the kind of 90s, early 2000s evangelical culture. But this is one thing that my youth group did really, really well by offering an apologetics course. And it was with this brilliant woman who had a degree in apologetics. And it was, I think, a 6-week course that was an hour before normal youth group in a separate room where the seniors would go if they chose to. And we were just taken through a curriculum of understanding the philosophical, historical, and scientific basis for our faith. For learning on an intellectual level why it was reasonable and intellectual and academic and intelligent to place your faith in Jesus Christ. Why it wasn't just a blind faith. Why there was enough solid evidence for faith in Jesus Christ that people, the likes of C.S. Lewis, for instance, placed their faith in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, as highly intelligent human beings, highly well-read, well-researched, well-rounded in the sciences and the histories and the arts. And they looked at the story of Jesus, looked at the scriptures, and looked at the evidence surrounding the scriptures, not just the Bible itself, and said, yeah, I actually believe this is true. That was what we studied as seniors in my youth group. And that experience never left me. I don't know why I'm getting emotional thinking about this. I just remember thinking, God is so good at giving us the resources that we need to discover him. He's so good at giving us the resources that we need to heal and to experience his goodness. But he also, in his gentleness and in his respect for our dignity, doesn't often force us to use those resources. He makes them available, and then he gives us the freedom to choose. He gives us the free will to decide if we're going to engage in our life, and in doing so, discover his goodness. And for me, the first time that I made the decision to use my free will to engage in my life, it was when I reached out and asked my mom for help. And one of the other big pivotal moments was when I decided to sign up for this course. And I realized that there was within me this burning need to understand why the God of the Bible was the one true God on an intellectual level, on an academic level. I was a straight A student. I was a scholastic person. I was an academic. And I just thought, well, if God is real, then there will be reasonable evidence for belief in him. He won't just expect us to believe in him on blind faith, because why would God make us intellectual? Why would he give us curiosity and intelligence if he wasn't going to allow us to use those gifts to find him, to discover more about him? And so I took this apologetics course, and it created a fundamental framework in which my faith has grown and developed. And even in later seasons in my life where I've gone a bit complacent in my faith, I've never been able to go back to where I was as a sort of preteen, where I decided God might not even be real, or if he's real, he's not good, but he might not even be real at all. I couldn't go back to that place of questioning whether or not he was real. Now, don't get me wrong. We all have seasons of doubt, and there are still moments where I sit here and I think I've even said it on the podcast. This is wild what we're claiming to believe. I was at church yesterday for Easter Sunday, and our pastor was like, it's still really wild to say that we believe that a man died and then rose again 3 days later. Like, that is wild. And yet there's also so much legitimate historical evidence for it being true. God doesn't just ask us to believe on blind faith. He gives us a lot to engage our intellect. And so that added a layer to my faith that has been unshakable since I was about 18 years old, was attending that apologetics course. And then I had a serious family trauma, and my parents had to split up because my dad had developed a very serious addiction problem, which he was not willing to get help for. And so, unfortunately, that resulted in a really traumatic and dramatic family schism. And my mum and brother and I found ourselves virtually homeless right after I graduated high school. And so I had all these plans to go to a art university up in San Francisco and study film. I was really artistic at the time, and I still had yet to really discover how God was going to engage the creative side of me. He'd engaged my intellectual side, but the creative side took a little bit longer for me to plug into my faith ecosystem. But I knew that I wanted to make art. I knew that I wanted to tell stories. And I loved photography and cinematography, and I did that all throughout high school. And so I'd gotten in to 2 different art academies in San Francisco on scholarship, and I had plans to go. And then my world exploded, and my high school sweetheart moved up north to go to university. We ended up splitting because that happens after high school. And my friend base had all gone away to university, and I couldn't afford to go. I was a straight A student. I'd graduated in the top 5% of my class, and I was stuck living in a back room of a family member's house who I hadn't seen in 15 years because it was the only place where my mom and I could safely go. And I just remember thinking, God is all I have now. So I went from in my preteens thinking, this whole world looks to be filled with good things, but God does not seem to be one of them, to after graduation looking around and thinking, this whole world seems to be filled with bad things, but God is not one of them. And He'd built my faith to a point where all I could do was throw myself into writing about Him and loving Him and trusting Him. And I went through a very serious season of depression, understandably. I was helping my mom raise my little brother. We were both working as hard as we could. We were living in a new town, quite far away from our community because it was the only safe place we could go. And I had just broken up from someone I thought I was going to marry at the time. And that's quite common when you are raised in evangelical culture. It's very common in the US that you get married around 19, 20 years old, and you marry the guy who plays in the worship band, and I had that whole narrative in my head. And so my whole world was crumbling down around me as my friends had moved away. I had moved to a new town. My family had split up. I was homeless, helping my mom look after my brother. We were sleeping on an air mattress in a back room for about 4 or 5 months, and we were working like crazy at minimum wage jobs. And I was taking online classes from the art academy that I had hoped I would be attending in person in San Francisco. And I just remember thinking, I've lost almost everything. Thankfully, I've not lost my mom and my brother. I've not lost my health, or my physical health anyway. But I've lost my dreams for going to university. I'm only able to attend online. This whole picture that I had in my head just disintegrated. And I was doing pretty much nothing but working, picking my brother up from school, sleeping and writing. I would sleep through days at a time, and then I would wake up at sort of 4 or 5 p.m. and obviously couldn't go back to sleep at a reasonable hour because I'd been sleeping all day. And I would just write and write and write and write. So I was taking online classes from, this film school at an art academy. But I found myself really connecting with God through writing because God was the last really good thing that I had. And I didn't blame him like I did when I was younger for my OCD. I didn't blame him for the situation that we were in. If anything, I knew that he was the only one getting me through. And I kept writing and writing and writing. And about 4 or 5 months in to my world exploding, I had a relative who lived in the UK who just randomly, out of nowhere, I hadn't seen her since I was 3 years old, invited me to come and stay with her and her husband in the UK. And I had always had this deep affinity for all things British culture and Scottish culture and Irish culture. Like every element of that corner of the world, I had just been drawn to. Films and books and music and design and jewelry. It had just sung to my soul since I was a tiny girl. And so I'd always joked with friends that when I graduated, I was going to get on a plane and move to England. But obviously at the time, I didn't really know how that was going to be possible because in the US, that kind of journey is a once in a lifetime thing. Because the US is so big, you don't often travel that far nonchalantly, shall we say, because you could be on a plane for 5 hours and still be in America. So I didn't really think I was going to be able to go to England at 18 years old. I didn't know how I would afford it. I lost all my college savings because that was one of the many things that was sort of lost in the wreckage of my family's breakdown. We had no money. I had no idea how. But that longing in my heart had been one of the most fundamental parts of my identity for as long as I could remember, was this deep, just almost magnetic attraction to the UK. And then one of those miracles of God's resourcing just fell into my lap. And I had a family member who said, "Why don't you come stay with me? I'll buy you a ticket." And because I wasn't going to university in person, I was taking classes online. I was mobile. I could go. So with my broken heart and my 2 suitcases, I hopped on a plane and I went to the north of England in the Peak District and stayed there for 5 months. And while I was there, I had a rom-com level narrative unfold before my very eyes. And I went from being broken and timid and clinging to God for dear life because I didn't know what else to cling to, which, granted, God was the right choice, but I was so unwilling to attach myself to anything at all because my whole world had imploded and my boyfriend had left me and my dad had left us in the most horrific way and I was heartbroken and I didn't trust anything. And God just plunged me into this world of utter beauty. And from the second I stepped off the plane, it was like this, every cell in my body was electrified. I felt like my body was humming this mantra of welcome home, welcome home, welcome home. It's so hard to explain to someone who hasn't had a sense of deep belonging in a physical location. But that was England for me. It was like I had been drawn by a magnet from the time I was a child, and I was finally united with this place that had been calling my name since I was a little girl. And I just fell in love. I fell in love with the country, the landscape. I would go for walks and look at the hills and just cry at the way that God's beauty and goodness was just woven into the lines of the hills against the sky. And while I was there, I met a boy, and it was so sweet and lovely, and he took me for walks around the lake and to ice skating rinks and to art galleries, and he courted me with a gentleness, even though I felt so profoundly broken and still quite afraid to trust anything or anyone again. And he would remind me to laugh and not take things so seriously, and he had the loveliest little gap in his front teeth and these little wrinkles around his eyes when he would smile. And I fell in love with him. And I never looked back. So when my traveler's visa came to an end after sort of, a 5-6 month time in the UK, I hugged him goodbye at the airport, and he came and followed me back out to the US 3 weeks later, spent the summer with me, and it was at that point that we decided that we were going to really try long distance and see how it would work. And I had no idea the mammoth task that was facing me with the immigration maze that you have to navigate by moving to the UK. And had I known how hard it was going to be to move to the UK, I think I would have just crumbled in fear and never even tried it. But thankfully, I only had knowledge of the next step in front of me and the next step and the next step. So I had to stay in the US for 11 months while I worked and saved to go back to the UK the following year on a student visa. And at that point, I had this sort of revelation that while I loved film and photography and cinematography and sort of creating stories with imagery, that season in my life where I had done nothing but write to connect with God had felt like such a profound extension of who I was that I realized I didn't want to study film. I wanted to study creative writing. And so when I went to university in the UK and I had to start fresh, I couldn't transfer any credits. The whole credit system works differently here. I studied creative writing and literature. I got into a university that was about a 45-minute train journey from the little town where my boyfriend lived. And I did my degree and I loved it. And I got to start exploring both my academic side, my intellectual side, and my creative side. And I made so many friends, and I fell into a sense of home, and I always felt, like God had called me to exactly where I was. I missed my family terribly. I missed my mom. I missed my brother. But I knew I was where I was supposed to be. And my early 20s were stunning. They were absolutely stunning. They were hard. And I had so many immigration hurdles and mistakes that were made by my university that jeopardized my immigration status on more than one occasion. And I was constantly faced with this mammoth task of finding thousands of pounds every 2 years, money I didn't have, to stay in the UK. And God always provided. And at some point I might share some of the more specific and incredible miracles that God did perform to keep me in the UK. But my faith journey ebbed and flowed because I was in and out of church, and the UK's sort of fabric of faith is very different than the US. And when you go to university, you learn new things, you discover new things, but I never lost my faith. I just kind of went in and out of working out how my faith fit into my life rather than figuring out how my life fit into my faith. And after a fair few years of being with my boyfriend, we decided that it was time to get married. And he proposed to me in the most beautiful way, and we started planning our wedding for 2020. This is a part of my story that I have shared on the podcast before, on the Christmas special with Dusty. But for me, my wedding wasn't just a wedding. Since my parents had split, I had really been faced with this choice about whether or not I was going to allow my parents' divorce to fracture my belief in marriage, in God's goodness in marriage. And it was a really pivotal moment for me in deciding what kind of person I wanted to be. Do I want to be someone who fights for joy and the belief in redemption's victory over our lives? Or do I want to be someone who lives out of fear and doesn't give too much of my hope to anything or my delight to anything because of the risk of it being broken or lost or stolen? And I chose to throw all my faith and joy and excitement and delight into believing that marriage could be good and that redemption does have victory in our lives and that I would get to see the goodness of God in the land of the living. And I'd always pictured that quite biblically like a wedding feast, which is described in Scripture a lot, this wedding feast as a picture of celebration and victory of redemption. And I'd pictured my own wedding day as like a declaration of who I was and what I stood for in choosing to give myself to another, in choosing to celebrate and be joyful and dance and laugh. But little did we know that in planning our wedding for 2020, the almost 10 years of dreaming that I'd had of this beautiful wedding that would be a declaration of God's goodness and worship and all these things I'd literally dreamt about for 10 years just fell apart. They turned to ash in my hands with COVID. And I know there were thousands of brides whose hearts were broken because their wedding was not what they planned because of COVID. And I know that everyone's got a COVID story of something that they lost, time, loved ones. And I think each story carries its own profound weight and burden and grief. But for me, I can honestly say that my wedding falling apart felt like the deepest betrayal from God that I could ever imagine, because He knew what a wedding meant for me. He knew it meant something different than just being in a pretty dress and having a party. He knew it meant a declaration of my very mantra for life was wrapped up in how we expressed ourselves and celebrated on our wedding day. And so our wedding fell apart, and within the tornado of that, we lost multiple family members that we loved. My fiance and I, my husband and I now, we, spoiler alert, got married. And it was just, there was such a grief. We were living in the tiniest little 19th century cottage that was just packed floor to ceiling and was the most difficult place to be during lockdown. And we were dealing with severe depression. My husband's depression was through the roof because of his work situation and working from home for so long during lockdown. I was commuting, driving 4 hours a day to my job in between like the lockdown periods when the offices would open up again. I was driving and driving and driving, living in a sardine box effectively. We tried to buy a house and the house sale fell through within a week of completion. Our wedding venue, our original wedding venue, had broken their contract with us, and we ended up having to go through a lawsuit because they were trying to steal thousands of pounds from us. And all at this time, I had found out about some weird tax stuff that I didn't know about because of my immigration status that I had to navigate on my own whilst grieving the death of multiple loved ones who'd passed away within this sort of 18-month period. All of this happened in 2020 and 2021. And for the third time in my life, I was kind of faced with this question about God. So when I had OCD, I came to the conclusion that either God wasn't good or He wasn't real. And then the second time I had a major trauma, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was the only good thing, and I knew He was real. And this time, because I felt so personally betrayed by God, and it was just grief after grief after grief after grief, and we felt completely trapped. And I related to the scripture in Job where Job says, "Why does God have me hedged in?" And I just felt like anywhere I turned, it was just ash in my mouth. Everything I tried to find hope in again, anything I tried to find joy in again, was just like ripped from my fingers over the course of 18 months. And I knew God was real. But this time I was questioning, how do I still believe that he's good? I wasn't questioning if he was good. And this is an important distinction. I was questioning how he could be good. I knew that he was who he said he was. I knew he was real. I knew that he was the God he described himself to be, the great I am, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. But I didn't know how that could be true when I looked around and my entire world was up in flames. And my grief extended beyond myself. I looked at the world at large, and this wasn't the first time I'd done this, right? But it became more personal for me to look at the world in large and see the suffering in the world and just think, how can God be good? How can God be good and people die of starvation? How can God be good and let women lose their babies in their womb? How can God be good? And for me, some of the things that I've just described to you in my own life probably seem quite small in comparison to some of the examples of general suffering that I've just listed. And yeah, losing a wedding is not like losing a child. I'll never claim that it is. But for me, it wasn't losing the wedding. It was feeling that God had seen me, told me he loved me, and then betrayed me in the most profound and personal way with the thing he knew I cared about most at that season in my life. And I believe that when we go through seasons of suffering, it is a thing we often have to wrestle through, is how could God betray me like this with whatever grief he's allowing us to go through? So I asked myself, how can God be good? How? And at the time, I was working in an environment where I was blessed to be surrounded by some mighty Christians, but I was doing daily tasks within my work, which I slowly realized were adding to my depression in a very micro way. And I didn't really notice it at first because there were so many macro things causing me to feel so depressed and so dark that it took a while for us to come out of that state of adrenaline and survival. We finally were able to move house. My husband found a new job. We felt like we were able to start breathing again towards the middle of 2021. And then I started to notice that one of the other micro things causing me to feel this dullness in life was the tasks that I was doing every day in my work. I was a copywriter for a nonprofit, and I did a lot of things that on paper I should have enjoyed, right? I had a bachelor's and master's degree in creative writing, and I was writing. What was the problem? But I realized that I was doing work and writing about things that just made me feel very flat. I realized over time that I'd lost all of my creativity. And that was another thing with my wedding, was that it was going to be a very creative and artistic event that my husband and I were going to pour ourselves into making things beautiful. I really value beauty and art as a form of worship. And so I'd lost that in the wedding. And then I also felt like I was kind of losing it in myself, just generally in the work that I was doing at the time. And that started to eat away at me, even as the logistics of mine and my husband's life started to decompress a bit, and we did finally get to move into a place where we had more breathing room, and he got to move into a job that he was enjoying more, and things got practically easier. And yet I still felt like just this heaviness over me, like whatever I'd lost during COVID, I could not find how to get it back. And I was living in such a state of fear. I almost refused to allow myself to find things that brought me joy. after the amount of things that we lost, thing after thing after thing after thing in an 18-month period, I was genuinely in a state of such trauma that every time my phone rang, I was anticipating that it would be a phone call telling me that my mum had passed away or I'd lost my brother in a car crash. I was so prepped and ready for another trauma because so many things had gone terribly wrong, and we had lost family members. Family members had died in the space of 18 months. I was like a wounded animal. And so I didn't notice how that approach that I was starting to take towards life, as I kept kind of questioning, how is God good? I was allowing that question, I was allowing that approach of fear towards my life to manifest in my work. And I was refusing to acknowledge that the work I was doing was also chipping away at who I was and inhibiting who I was, in the sense that I'm a deeply creative person and I was too afraid to experience the joy of creativity anymore. So when I was 18, God had really shown me how to engage my intellect and my academic side in discovering who He is and exploring my faith on an intellectual level. I started to feel this grief and this burden in not exploring and discovering who God was on a creative level. Over the next sort of 12 months, from 2021 to 2022, God started throwing tons of resources in my path again. For the first time ever, I had a stranger come up to me and speak a prophetic word over me, which had never happened before. And effectively, all he said was, God sees this darkness lying over you, and it's not from Him. He wants you to be more creative again. That was it. And it was wild, and it took my breath away, and I knew it was from God because it was so specific and so spot on, because I hadn't allowed myself to be creative anymore. It felt like too much of a risk to experience the joy of creativity anymore. And then my friend bought me a box set of books that ended up, it was a fictional story, but one of the huge morals of the story was how after trauma, the first thing you do is, if you're a creative, you stop creating because it hurts too much to allow yourself to hope for joy and creativity. And yet, by creating again, you are almost putting your stake in the ground and declaring that you do actually believe that joy can follow loss. And so those things all just kind of started weaving themselves together, and I realized that the work I was doing and the way I was spending my 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, were not allowing me to create, which meant that I wasn't allowing myself to fully be who God made me to be. And if I chose to continue down that path, I was effectively telling God that I didn't trust Him enough to give Him my heart again, to do something that brought me joy, for fear that the joy might be ripped away from me, like everything else had been ripped away from me in the years following COVID. And I had these resources that got put in my path to say, really? Are you sure? Because I know you've been asking how I'm still good, and I want to show you. But to do that, I need you to trust me again, just a little bit. Take the risk. Risk feeling joy and create again. And at that point, I just knew that I couldn't stay in the job that I was doing. I knew that as I was looking around me and seeing a world that had been so heartbroken through COVID, and so many people I loved who walked away from their faith entirely, as I had been tempted to do in the past, I knew that the only way that I could fiercely fight for those things I claimed I believed in, those things that I wanted my wedding to be, that declaration of redemption's victory, I knew that the only way that I could do that was to quit my job and give my life up to God as a living sacrifice by creating, by trusting Him again enough to give Him my joy, by being the person He made me to be, by being the academic and the artist, by experiencing my relationship with Him and my faith in Him through exploring Him intellectually and enjoying Him creatively. And in the process of doing that, in these last 12 months, that's led me up to starting this podcast and where we are now. Our wedding was redeemed. We got to have our wedding day belated in 2023 in a field that had a profound meaning to my husband and I, and it was the most stunning celebration of God's goodness, where we danced to violins and and looked out at the heather-covered fields as the sun went down and the stars came out, and it felt like, I remember when we did our last dance on that day, and I just collapsed into a chair and sobbed because I said to my friends, this is what heaven's going to be like. I got to experience a little piece of God's goodness because we chose to fight for our joy. We had our wedding day. We went and we spoke to the farmer of a field that we'd always sat in and loved spending time in. And that farmer let us rent that field, and we had a belated wedding celebration. And that was all such a risk, both because it was part of our wedding story that felt so personal, but also because it was, again, that choice to be creative and artistic and dance and sing and believe in redemption's victory. And around that same time, that's when I quit my job, and I'd had this burning desire to do a C.S. Lewis podcast, because I believe that Lewis is one of the best examples of someone who engages their faith both academically, intellectually, and creatively, artistically. His writing is a work of art, but it's also profoundly thought-provoking. And I can't be anything other than what I am, which is a person who believes that the goodness of God is there to be discovered even after grief, even after loss, and that he gives us the resources we need to find him and to engage with him both with our minds and with our hearts, both with our emotions and our intellect, with our creativity and our curiosity. And that's why I want to offer whatever I have inside me to other people, to encourage them and embolden them to find God too, to find God through their curiosity and their creativity, to read and be inspired by Lewis, as I have been. Lewis has been one of the fundamental authors in helping shape my faith and helping me see how I too can practice my faith as an intellect and an artist. And all I want to do is breathe that love out into the world as an invitation for you to experience God in that way too. So there you are. There's my testimony. And that leads me to something that I wanted to share with you. And this is the thing that I really, really labored over and chatted through with Dusty. Whether or not I was going to tell you about a resource that I have done, which is part of a separate aspect of my business. And the reason I labored over this is because I didn't want you to feel like you were being sold to. I didn't want to feel like slimy self-promotion. And yet Dusty kind of reminded me, Christina, you made this thing to help people. And if you don't tell them about it, that feels more slimy because you're doing it to bless them. You're doing it to help them. And so I've never really connected the two sides of my business, the podcast that I do here with you, which is about C.S. Lewis, and another side of my business that's about my own personal life writing and my services of helping teach other people who feel God's called them to write, how to write. I was an academic lecturer and I taught academic writing for 4 years, and I have a master's in creative writing and I have a bachelor's in creative writing, and I love to teach people how to write. And so I have developed a resource, which, here's the funny thing, I'm feeling salesy. This resource is free, but even telling you about it felt kind of weird to me, but here I am telling you about it because I want you to know about it. I've recently just released a resource called Invited by Joy, which, because you're in the C.S. Lewis space, hopefully you know that that's a play off of his book, Surprised by Joy. But it's a 7-day devotional that specifically, I wrote it for people who've always wanted to write a book. but they've never felt qualified enough or good enough as writers, or like a lot of people just think, well, who am I to write a book? What would I have to say? Why would anyone care what I have to say? But if you feel that God's called you to write a book and you have a story to share, like I just shared mine with you, gosh, I can't tell you how profoundly I've been shaped by books. And I didn't care who the author was so much as I was touched by their story. There aren't books that I picked up particularly because the person's name was noteworthy, but rather because their story compelled me. And if you've got a story to share about the goodness of God in your own life, I really believe that you should just pick up your pen and write it, because who knows who you might impact. Like Lewis has impacted me, and you, in theory, if you're here. So I've written this devotional. It's completely free to download. It's called Invited by Joy. And it's 7 days of Bible readings, a devotional reading to reflect on that day's Bible reading, and then memory verses, prayer prompts, and reflective journal prompts. And I'm really proud of it, and it's really robust, and it's taking you on a very intentional guided journey to discover your own creative practice as a way of engaging with God and being bold and writing that book that you've been called to write. And if that's something that you feel called to, and even if you don't want to write a book, but you just want to start writing more, like if you're the kind of person that thinks, oh, that's not for me, it probably is for you, because if you want to write and you just feel some sort of imposter syndrome telling you can't write, this is exactly why I wrote this devotional, and it's exactly why I'm offering it for free. So if that's something that would interest you, you can download it at christinalynwallace.substack.com. That is my personal Substack where I do more life writing, faith writing that isn't necessarily related to C.S. Lewis. My C.S. Lewis Substack is magiclikethis.substack.com, and you can subscribe to that for free to get the newsletters that come out with each episode, or you can subscribe for £5 a month to get the additional bonus episodes that I release for book club members. Either which way, I'd really, really love you to download this resource if you feel that you have been inhibited by experiencing God through your creativity and specifically your desire to write. So again, that is christinalynwallace.substack.com. You will get the free devotional there when you subscribe, and I really hope it blesses you. There you go, friends. That is today's Easter special, which was kind of, sort of, not at all C.S. Lewis related, but I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I really hope it gives you more insight into who I am, why I'm here, my intentions for this podcast and this book club, and how I hope it blesses you. If you want to connect with me on social media, you can do so at Magic Like This Podcast on Instagram, or my writer's Instagram is just at Christina Lynn Wallace. You can hang out with me on either space. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can do that at magiclikethis@substack.com via email. Either which way, I really hope that you are blessed. If this episode blessed you specifically, please maybe leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. I can't tell you how much that would help. Or just share it with a friend who you think it would bless. I covered so much today. I talked about mental health and OCD and creativity and trauma and, apologetics and all these different types of things. But if it connected with you in any particular way, I'd really love to hear from you and hear why. And I'd really love it if you would share it with someone else who you think it might bless. But all right, friends, that's all for today. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Bless you this Easter. Shalom, shalom.